I found out my family had sold my land because my niece added me to the wrong group chat and did not realise I was reading before she could remove me. That is the kind of sentence that still sounds strange in my own mouth even now. Not because the words are hard to understand, but because of how ordinary they looked at first. A little green notification, a new message thread lighting up my phone while I was standing at my kitchen counter with a dish towel in one hand and a half-cut peach in the other. Nothing about that moment looked like the beginning of a wound. The kettle was humming softly behind me. The afternoon light was falling across the linoleum in pale squares. I remember thinking I should wipe down the counter before the juice dried sticky. Then I looked down, and my life as I understood it shifted by one careless tap of someone else's thumb. At first, GDK thought it was another church committee chat. My family has always believed in gathering GDK rooms and then forgetting who might be listening. There were so many names stacked at the top that I had to put my glasses on. My brother Calvin, his wife Denise, my niece Asha, my cousin Loretta, even Calvin's son Marcus, who had not called me aunt in years, but still knew how to click a heart under other people's messages. I stared at the title of the group for a second, because it was bland enough to pass as innocent. Just Sunday plans. That was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. My family never names things plainly, when plainness would tell the truth too early. The first message I saw was from Denise. She had written, "We need to make sure May doesn't go by there this week." I remember that my hand did not shake right away. People think shock arrives like thunder. For me, it arrived like stillness. I stood there so quiet I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on. Then another message came through from Marcus. He wrote, "Closing already happened. What's left for her to see?" What was left for me to see? I read that line 3 times. The peach juice had started to run between my fingers and I still did not move. A little bubble appeared, then vanished, then came back. Asha typed, "I told y'all to leave her out until everything clears. She only got this because I clicked the wrong thread." That was when the air in my kitchen changed. Nothing visible, nothing dramatic. But I felt it, the way you feel a room change when someone has said something cruel in a soft voice and everybody decides not to mention it. The kind of quiet that lets you know something had already been going on long before you arrived. I set the knife down very carefully. Then I wiped my hand on the towel and kept reading. Because by then I understood enough to know that whatever I had just stepped into was not confusion. It was a conversation already in motion. Calvin wrote, "Just remove her and stop texting details." Then Denise sent the message that cracked something open in me. She wrote, "We gave her more than enough time. Daddy's gone." The taxes were stacking up. Somebody had to be practical. Daddy. The land they were talking about had belonged to my father before he died. 42 acres just outside Pine Hollow, where the road narrowed and the air changed and the soil GK down and thick after rain. People call it land as if that word is simple, as if it means acreage and fencing and market value and not memory. But my father never spoke about it that way. He would say, "That ground remembers our footsteps." He said it when I was a girl and walked behind him through the tall weeds with my socks wet from dew. He said it when he taught me how to check the boundary markers. He said it after my mother died, when the fields looked lonelier and he began standing still for longer than usual at the edge of the tree line, as if listening for a voice the rest of us could not hear. I was the one who went with him most often in those later years. Calvin had his own business by then, and a way of sounding burdened even when nobody had asked anything from him. My cousins loved the property in the abstract. They liked to mention it at reunions, liked to say our people had held on to something. But I was the one who knew where the fence sagged after heavy storms. I was the one who kept the old tax notices in labelled envelopes. I was the one who could still find the creek by sound before I could see it. After Daddy died, the land became one of those things the family spoke about carefully, but never clearly. Everyone agreed it should stay in the family. Everyone agreed we needed time. Everyone agreed feelings were still raw. That was how my relatives handled difficult things. They wrapped delay in tenderness until no one could tell whether they were protecting grief or hiding intent. At the time, I thought we were being gentle with one another. Looking back now, I can see how useful gentleness is to people who do not want to be pinned down. The messages kept coming while I stood there with my heart slowly understanding what my mind was trying to resist. Loretta wrote, "She was never going to build on it anyway." Marcus answered, "Exactly. Better somebody get value out of it." Then Asha, my sweet-faced niece with her careful lashes and her warm little hugs at Christmas, sent the sentence that hurt me more than the word sold. She wrote, "She always gets emotional about Grandpa's promises. That's why nobody wanted to tell her until it was done." I had to sit down after that. Not because I felt faint, because suddenly I understood that I was not reading people panicking in the middle of a mistake. I was reading a settled opinion of me. I was reading the version of me they had been carrying around in private. The difficult aunt, the sentimental one. The woman who could be managed if handled gently enough, delayed long enough, spoken around rather than spoken to. They had not forgotten I existed. What they had forgotten was that silence and invisibility are not the same thing. I lowered myself into the chair by the window and looked out at the little strip of yard behind my house. My bird feeder was half empty. 2 finches were hopping at the base of it, pecking through what had fallen. I remember that because pain has a strange way of fastening itself to small, ordinary things. Even now, I cannot think of that afternoon without seeing those birds. The world outside my body was still so calm. A passing car, a dog barking down the block, sunlight on the fence. And inside me, all the old rooms of my family had begun unlocking themselves, one by one. It was not just the group chat, it was everything that rose up behind it. The extra sweetness in Denise's voice 2 Sundays ago when she asked if I had been getting enough rest. The way Calvin had stopped meeting my eyes at my father's grave in April. The afternoon Marcus came by with barbecue and spent too long asking whether I still drove out toward Pine Hollow by myself. I had taken those things separately. A kindness here, a question there. Ordinary concern. But betrayal has a pattern to it, and once you see the shape of one piece, the others begin to move toward it. 3 weeks before that message, Asha had taken me to lunch. That had surprised me because she was always busy and usually loved me in bright, efficient little bursts. She kissed my cheek, ordered me sweet tea before I sat down, and asked me stories about Grandpa like she was gathering family history for some tender reason of her own. I remember feeling touched by that. I remember telling her about the summer Daddy let me steer the truck across the back edge of the property while Calvin shouted that I would hit the fence post. I remember how she smiled and said, "Grandpa trusted you with everything, Aunt May." At the time, that sentence warmed me. Sitting in my kitchen with that group chat glowing in my hand, I finally heard the weight of it. She had not been reminiscing. She had been measuring what I knew. There is a particular humiliation in realizing that warmth was used to soften you before the knife. I went back to the messages. Nobody had removed me yet. Maybe they were all calling each other. Maybe they were frozen. Maybe they thought if they stayed still long enough, I would somehow become harmless again. Calvin finally wrote, "Stop sending anything else. I'll handle May." That line sat on my screen like an old family sickness with a fresh shirt on. I'll handle May. Not I'll call her. Not we need to explain. Not, we made a terrible mistake. Just the same old instinct dressed up as leadership. I had heard that tone my whole life. Calvin was older by 6 years and had always moved through the family as if authority naturally settled on his shoulders, whether he earned it or not. When we were children, he decided which chores mattered and which could wait. When our mother got sick, he became the voice that told visitors what kind of day she was having. When Daddy aged, Calvin began speaking slower around him, as if patience itself gave him ownership over every decision in the room. And Daddy let him, more than he should have. That was a truth I had only allowed myself to say privately after the funeral. My father loved us both, but he trusted me quietly and trusted Calvin publicly. Those are two very different kinds of trust, and only one of them tends to survive a death. I got up from the chair and walked to the drawer by the refrigerator where I kept my important papers. Not because I had suddenly become brave, because I needed to touch something real. The folder with the land tax receipts was still there, soft at the corners from being handled over time. Inside were copies of payments, county notices, an old survey map with Daddy's penciled notes in the margins, and a folded letter in his uneven hand that I had not opened in months because I knew every sentence by heart. My fingers stopped over it anyway. I did not read it then. I only stood there holding those papers while my phone buzzed again and again on the table behind me. I knew without looking that Calvin was calling. I knew Denise would follow if I let it ring long enough. Maybe even Asher, with that breathy little voice people use when they want forgiveness before they have offered truth. For a moment, I closed my eyes and tried to steady myself against the counter. What hurt most in that first hour was not even the possibility that they had sold the land. It was the terrible new understanding that they had built a whole version of reality in which my absence had already been agreed upon. They had talked, planned, decided, joked, and moved money around a piece of ground my father had spent a lifetime protecting, and somewhere inside all of that, they had made peace with not telling me. Not because they forgot, because they believed I could be absorbed after the fact, like weather, like disappointment, like one more thing the family did not need to stop for. My phone started ringing again, and I finally turned to look at it. Calvin's name filled the screen, steady and familiar, and for the first time in my life, I saw it not as family reaching for me, but as someone trying to get to the story before the truth did. I let it ring until the sound itself began to feel like pressure against my chest. Then I turned the phone face down on the table and listened to the silence that followed. It did not feel peaceful. It felt crowded. Like the room was suddenly full of all the things my family had not said to me in the last 6 months, all standing there at once. I remember looking at the folder in my hands and realising that if I answered Calvin before I looked at those papers, I would be stepping back into the role they had already chosen for me. The emotional one, the confused one, the sister who could be soothed, redirected and talked over before she had put the facts in order. So I made myself do the least dramatic thing I could think of. I sat back down at the kitchen table, put on my glasses properly, and began laying the papers out one by one on the wood, as if I were setting places for difficult guests. Tax receipts, county notices, the old survey map, a copy of Daddy's death certificate, an envelope with my own handwriting from 2 years before, when I had mailed a cheque because Calvin said he was waiting on some accounts to settle and did not want the taxes to go late. I had forgotten that cheque until I saw the stub. Forgotten the way Denise called the next week and thanked me in that syrupy voice of hers, saying, "We all appreciate you stepping in." At the time it had sounded like family. Now it sounded like rehearsal. The phone rang again. Then stopped. Then a message appeared from Calvin asking me to call him back because there had been a misunderstanding. I stared at that word so long it lost shape. Misunderstanding. There is a special insult in being asked to call betrayal by a softer name while the wound is still warm. I did not answer him. Instead, I unfolded Daddy's letter. His handwriting looked thinner than I remembered, more careful around the edges, as though he had been trying not to waste strength. He had written it the year before he died, after one of his hospital appointments, when there had been more talking around him than to him, and he came home quieter than usual. The letter was not long. Daddy was never a man for speeches, but it said enough. He wrote that the Pine Hollow property was not to be treated like a spare asset. He wrote that if anything happened to him, I would know how to watch over it, because I had listened when he talked and looked when he pointed. He wrote that Calvin was good with numbers, but impatient with memory, and that impatience was dangerous in matters that carried blood and history. I had read those lines before with sadness. That afternoon, I read them with a different kind of ache. Not because they surprised me, but because I suddenly understood how much Daddy had seen and how carefully he had tried to say it without starting a war before he died. I turned to the survey map next. His pencil notes were still there by the creek line and the west fence, little practical reminders in the margin about runoff and an old gate hinge. At the bottom, beside the southern corner, he had written, "May knows this ground." That was all. 4 words. But my throat tightened around them so hard I had to look away. It is a painful thing to realise that a dead man kept better faith with you than the living ones sitting in church clothes at your table after the funeral. By evening, I had pulled everything I owned that touched that property into one room. File boxes from the hall closet, a tin where I kept old receipts, 2 photographs from the den cabinet, one of Daddy standing by the tractor with mud up his boots, the other of me at 19 with my jeans rolled at the ankles and my hair tied up in a scarf, holding a fence post steady while he grinned at something out of frame. The house grew dim around me while I worked. I did not turn on the television. I did not cook dinner. I just kept gathering paper and memory, as if the shape of the truth might reveal itself more clearly if I placed every piece under the same light. What emerged first was not proof of the sale. It was the pattern of who had quietly trained me not to ask the next question. Calvin had always been the one who handled the official conversations after Daddy got older. He dealt with the bank manager, the feed supplier, the county office when something needed updating. He liked fluorescent lighting and counters and people who wore lanyards. I used to tell myself that everybody has their place in a family, and perhaps that was his. But looking through those records, I saw how often practical control had been used to keep emotional authority in his hands. He would summarize things instead of showing them. He would say, "I took care of it," in the same tone a man might use for fixing a broken gutter. And because he said it with confidence, the rest of us let relief do the rest. There was one county tax notice from the year after Daddy died that had been redirected to Calvin's business address. I held it for a long time, trying to remember whether anyone had told me that. No one had. Another envelope had a note paperclipped to it in Denise's handwriting. "May paid this one. Keep track." That sentence chilled me more than I expected. Not because it was proof of theft, because it revealed a mentality. I was not being treated like a co-owner, or even like a grieving daughter whose interests mattered. I was an entry, a variable, a cost that needed managing. The next morning, I drove to the property. I told myself I only wanted to see whether anything had changed. But somewhere underneath that, I knew I was driving toward a second blow. The road out to Pine Hollow looked exactly as it always had. Long stretches of open shoulder, a leaning mailbox half swallowed by weeds. The place where the pavement cracked near the bend, and Daddy used to mutter that the county had money for everything except what mattered. It was a bright day, almost offensively bright. the kind that makes every contour sharper than your heart wants it to be. As I turned onto the gravel lane, I saw fresh tyre tracks before I saw anything else. 2 parallel lines cut into the dirt, recent enough that the edges still held their shape. Then I saw orange survey flags near the far side of the field. Not many. Just enough to tell me somebody had been measuring without the land's permission. I sat behind the wheel with the engine idling and felt something inside me go very still again. My father used to say that some injuries arrive twice, first as suspicion, then as confirmation. I got out slowly. The air smelled like warm grass and dust and the faint sweetness of wild clover. Birds were moving in the tree line. A truck I did not recognise was parked near the back gate. No one was in it. I walked to the old fence and laid my hand against the wood, rough and sun-heated under my palm. I cannot fully explain why that small touch steadied me, only that it did. There are places that know you before language does, places that hold the shape of your body moving through them year after year. Standing there, I understood that what my family had been counting on was not just ignorance. It was distance. They thought if enough time passed between Daddy's death and their decision, the land would stop feeling like mine in any meaningful way. But grief does not erase the body's map of what it belongs to. I heard a car coming up the lane and turned to see Denise's SUV pulling in faster than it needed to. That surprised me. Calvin was usually the one who came first when control was slipping. Denise got out, wearing sunglasses too large for her face and a smile that looked assembled on the drive over. She held her purse against her side as if she were visiting somebody in the hospital. She said my name in that soft, careful tone she used when she wanted to sound maternal. I did not answer right away. I kept looking at the orange flags behind her shoulder. Denise came a little closer and said, "Calvin's been trying to reach you. We didn't want you to get upset before we could explain." That line nearly made me laugh, though there was nothing funny in me. Upset before we could explain. As if explanation were some delicate gift they had been preparing. As if my role in all of this was to regulate my emotions until their version of events could be laid neatly over the facts. I asked her one question. I asked, "What exactly did you think I saw in that group chat?" Her mouth changed before her words did, just for a second. A tightening at one corner, a small calculation. Then she said, "It wasn't finalised the way it sounds." That was my first clean taste of how they meant to survive this. Not by telling one bold lie, but by shaving the edges off each truth until it barely looked like itself. I looked past her toward the field and asked what the survey flags were for. She followed my gaze too slowly. Then she said the county had required some things before transfer paperwork could be completed. There it was. Transfer paperwork. Not a misunderstanding. Not family confusion. A transaction with vocabulary already attached to it. I asked her who signed. For the first time, the careful sweetness fell out of her voice. She said, "May, nobody was trying to hurt you. The taxes were too much, and Calvin has been carrying more than anybody knows. We all agreed it was time. We all agreed." There are sentences that reveal more by what they skip than by what they say. She did not say the property needed to be sold. She did not say there had been no choice. She said we all agreed, which meant the truth had already shifted in her own mind from whether they had the right to do it to whether they had enough people nodding when they did. I asked again who signed. She took her sunglasses off then, perhaps to look more sincere, perhaps because she could see the softness was no longer working. Her eyes were tired, but not guilty in the way I expected, more irritated than ashamed, as if the burden of this moment was that I had made it harder than necessary. Denise said, "Your name was never on the main papers the way you think. Your father talked a lot, but talk isn't title. For a second I could not breathe properly. Not because I believed her completely, because I heard, inside that sentence, the deepest wound beneath the sail. They had not only gambled with legal paperwork, they had decided my father's word had become disposable the moment he could no longer defend it. And then she added the line that changed the whole shape of my grief. She said it quietly, almost kindly. Denise said, "Honey, people were starting to say you only held on to that land because it was the last place anyone still had to remember you mattered." If she had slapped me, it would have been simpler. I do not know whether those exact words had been said elsewhere, or whether she dressed up her own cruelty in the phrase, "people were starting to say." In a family, that phrase is often a hiding place. But I knew the wound inside it, because it matched too many little silences that had come before. The birthdays that grew smaller after Daddy died. The way younger relatives now spoke around me instead of to me when plans were being made. The church potlucks, where I found myself smiling through conversations that had no room for the version of me that once belonged. Denise had not just insulted me. She had voiced the role the family had quietly been offering me for some time now. Sentimental. Left behind. A woman living too long inside memory. I looked at her, at the flags, at the truck, at the field turning gold under that bright, indifferent sky, and felt something inside me settle into a clarity I had not had the day before. Hurt was still there. Shock was still there. But confusion was leaving, and with it went my last desire to be gentle on their behalf. I told Denise to move her car from the lane and leave my father's land. She actually blinked at the word "my." Then she said, "May, don't make this uglier than it already is." I said, "Denise, ugly is when a family sells something behind your back and then tries to convince you the wound is your tone." She stared at me for a long moment, and in that pause I saw the first real sign that they had miscalculated. Not because I had shouted. I had not. But because calm, once it belongs to the right person, can be a kind of door closing. She put her sunglasses back on, muttered that Calvin would call me, and walked back toward her SUV with the tight, efficient steps of a woman who had run out of softness and did not know what else to wear. I stayed after she left. I walked the edge of the field as far as my knees would let me, counting the flags, noting the fresh cuts in the brush near the back corner, seeing things that would once have looked innocent to me and now seemed arranged. By the time I returned to my car, I knew two things. First, they had moved further than I first feared. Second, they had not moved as cleanly as they wanted me to believe. Because beneath one of the orange markers, half hidden in the grass, was a scrap of white paper pinned by a stone. A copy sheet, folded and damp at one edge, likely dropped by somebody in a hurry. I bent to pick it up, and when I opened it, I saw a parcel reference, a buyer's name I did not know, and a line that made my mouth go dry. Pending seller confirmation on remaining interest holder. I stood there with the paper trembling lightly in my hand, not from weakness now, but from the first hard pulse of purpose. They had acted as if everything was done. They had mocked me as if I were already erased. But somebody, somewhere in that process, still knew there was a piece of me they had not gotten past yet. And once I understood that, I knew exactly what I would do next. I stood there with that damp sheet of paper in my hand and felt something stronger than anger move through me. Anger can make you loud. This was quieter than that, cleaner. It was the feeling of finally seeing the edge of the trap instead of just the panic of being caught in it. They had been speaking as if the land was already gone, as if my only remaining role was to absorb the news with whatever dignity they left me. But that line on the paper told a different story. Remaining interest holder. Somebody in that process knew there was still a legal shape around me, whether my family respected it or not. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my purse. Then I walked the property one more time, slowly, forcing myself to notice what panic would have missed. The flags were concentrated near the southern line, where the road access would make the parcel more attractive to a buyer. The brush had been cut back just enough to open sightlines. Even the truck parked near the back gate had left deep impressions in the dirt, meaning it had either been loaded heavily or had sat there longer than a quick visit required. These were not the signs of a family floating an idea. These were the signs of people already picturing money in their hands. On the drive home, Calvin called again, then Marcus, then Calvin once more. I let each call pass. Not because I was trying to punish them, because I understood something that had taken me too many years to learn. The first person to rush you into conversation after betrayal is rarely trying to restore trust. They are trying to regain control of the order in which facts enter the room. When I got home, I made coffee I did not want and spread everything back across the kitchen table. The late sun had shifted by then, flattening the light into something pale and tired. I laid the scrap of paper beside the tax receipts and Daddy's letter, then took out a notebook and began writing down every detail I could remember in the order it had surfaced. The group chat, Denise's exact phrasing, the survey flags, the buyer's reference number, the line about remaining interest holder. I even wrote down the time I arrived and the colour of Denise's blouse, because once a person starts trying to blur your reality, precision becomes a kind of self-respect. I slept badly that night. Not restlessly exactly, more like somebody lying beside her own life and no longer trusting its shape in the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, little earlier moments returned to me with new edges. Calvin insisting last winter that he would handle the county stuff. Marcus asking whether I still had copies of the old survey. Loretta at Easter saying with a strange little laugh that land only matters if someone still has the strength to enjoy it. At the time, I had taken that as careless talk. Now I heard the testing inside it. People will often tell you what they think of your place in the world long before they make their move. They just bury it inside ordinary conversation and trust your good manners to carry it past the point of alarm. The next morning, I called the county records office. I had to wait through hold music and a woman with a clipped, efficient voice asking for parcel numbers twice because my first answer was too soft. I gave her the reference from the paper, then the parcel description from the old survey map. She put me on hold again, and those 3 minutes stretched longer than some funerals feel. When she came back, her tone had changed slightly. Not warmer, just more attentive. She said there had been recent activity tied to the parcel, but she could not discuss the full transaction over the phone without identity verification and a records request. Then she said something that made the hair rise on my arms. She said one portion of the file reflected outstanding ownership clarification. I asked whether any final deed transfer had been recorded. She paused, then said, "Not in completed form for all interests associated with that parcel." I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still. That was the moment I stopped hoping this would somehow resolve inside the family. Up until then, some private, foolish part of me had still been waiting for a version of events that, while ugly, could be understood as confusion, haste, maybe even grief expressed through bad judgment. But the language had hardened now. Activity, clarification, interests, completed form. My family had not merely talked behind my back. They had pushed forward in process, in assumption, in appetite, and they had done it far enough to create consequences without securing the one thing they needed most from me: surrender. I spent that afternoon doing something I wish I had done years earlier. I called Evelyn Hart. Evelyn was a lawyer in town who had helped Daddy once with an easement dispute involving the north boundary and a neighbouring cattle line. She was not flashy, not particularly warm in the decorative sense, and exactly the kind of woman Calvin disliked because she listened without being impressed. I had not spoken to her since Daddy's funeral, but she remembered me immediately. When I explained, in careful pieces, what had happened, she did not interrupt with comfort. She asked questions. Who had been paying the taxes? What had Daddy said in writing, if anything? Whether probate had been fully closed? Whether I had ever signed a quitclaim, waiver, consent, or transfer acknowledgement. I answered each one as cleanly as I could. Then Evelyn said, "May, bring every document you have, and do not speak to them alone again if you can help it." Her office smelled faintly of paper dust and lemon polish, exactly as it had years ago. I arrived with a tote bag full of folders and the tight, dry feeling of someone who knows her heart is ahead of her body. Evelyn sat behind the same broad wooden desk, grey-haired now, glasses low on her nose, and read through my papers with the kind of attention that makes time feel merciless. She asked me to repeat Denise's exact words. She copied the parcel reference from the scrap I found at the property. She read Daddy's letter twice. At one point, she leaned back and let out a slow breath. Then she tapped the letter with one finger and said, "This may not control title by itself, but it matters. Especially if there was a pattern of understanding around your role and the property's intended management." Then she looked at the tax receipts and added, "And these matter too. You were not absent from this land. You were participating in its maintenance." That sentence nearly undid me more than anything else had, because by then I realised how starved I was for plain recognition. Not flattery, not sympathy, just someone naming the truth without trying to soften it into something easier for other people to survive. Evelyn made a few calls while I sat there. Quiet, direct calls to a title contact, someone at the county clerk's office, and then another attorney whose name I did not know. She never performed outrage. She never used that false, warm tone people adopt when they want you to feel taken care of without actually being helped. By the time she put the phone down, the picture had sharpened enough to hurt. Calvin had apparently been presenting himself as the primary acting family representative over the parcel for months. There had been preliminary sale movement. There had been buyer interest. There had been document circulation. But the title chain and probate posture were not as clean as he had implied, and at least one party in the process had flagged unresolved ownership exposure. In plain English, Calvin had been acting like a man who believed enough confidence could carry him across a legal gap before anyone bothered measuring it. I asked Evelyn whether they had broken the law. She held my gaze for a second before answering, and I appreciated that she respected the weight of the question. Then she said, "They have certainly behaved as though your position did not matter. Whether that rises to fraud, misrepresentation, breach of duty, or coercive concealment depends on documents, timing, and intent. But I can tell you this. They were counting on your silence." I looked down at my hands after she said that. They were folded too tightly in my lap. I loosened them finger by finger. Silence. That was the true asset they had been trying to sell. Before I left, Evelyn drafted a records request and a formal notice instructing involved parties to preserve all transaction-related communications and to cease any representation that the parcel was free of dispute. She said she would send letters that day. She also told me not to destroy anything, not to delete the group chat, and not to let myself be pulled into emotional negotiations dressed up as reconciliation. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Sometimes the worst theft is not the property. It is the presumption that you will accept being written out of the story." I carried that sentence home like something warm. For 2 days, the family went strangely quiet. No calls, no apologetic texts, No breathless voice notes from Asher. Just a hush so complete it felt unnatural. Then, on the third evening, Calvin came to my house. I saw his truck from the living room window before he knocked. He parked too straight, too close to the curb, like a man trying to impose order before the conversation began. When I opened the door, he was holding a paper bag from the bakery on Main Street. That made me sadder than if he had come empty-handed. In our family, sweets have always been used where honesty should have been. He stood there in his work shirt, face drawn tighter than usual, the bag hanging from one hand. He said, "I brought you pecan rolls." I said, "You should have brought the truth." For a second, something flashed across his face that looked almost like embarrassment. Then it settled into the older expression I knew too well, the one that meant he had decided I was making things harder than necessary. He stepped inside when I moved back, though I had not invited him warmly, and placed the bakery bag on the counter like a peace offering between countries that had already crossed each other's borders. He did not sit until I did. That was deliberate. Calvin likes hierarchy, but he likes plausible courtesy even more. For a moment he looked around my kitchen as if the room itself might help him return us to familiar roles. The sugar jar, the clock, the yellow curtains I had not changed in 12 years. Then he clasped his hands and gave me the voice he uses for funerals and billing problems. He said, "May, this has gotten bigger than it needed to because you saw fragments before the process was explained." Fragments. Process. Explained. There it all was again. His entire theology of control resting inside 3 polite words. I asked him whether he had tried to sell Daddy's land without telling me. He looked down once, then back up. He said, "I was trying to keep the family from drowning in taxes and indecision." That answer told me everything. He still could not bring himself to speak of me as someone wronged, only of himself as someone burdened. I asked whether he had represented the parcel as clear for sale. He leaned back, exhaled sharply through his nose, and said, "I represented it as something I have been carrying while you held on to feelings." That line entered the room like cold metal. Not because it was loud, because it revealed the shape of his contempt more honestly than the group chat had. I have been carrying while you held on to feelings. In one sentence, he made himself the labouring adult and me the inconvenient child. He stripped memory of value, grief of legitimacy, and my years of quiet care down to something unserious. It was the cleanest expression yet of what they had all been doing in softer ways. Reducing my relationship to that land until it looked sentimental enough to be ignored. I looked at him and, for the first time since Daddy died, I no longer saw my older brother as confused by pain or hardened by responsibility. I saw a man who had mistaken access for ownership and practicality for moral right. I said, "Calvin, you are not carrying family if the first thing you drop is me." He flinched. Only slightly. Only for a second. But I saw it, and once I saw it, I knew the line had landed exactly where it needed to. He opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to pivot toward money again, but I did not let him retake the room. I told him Evelyn Hart had the file, that formal notices had gone out, that no one would be discussing the parcel with me verbally anymore, and that if he or anyone else stepped onto that property under false authority again, I would treat it accordingly. His face changed at Evelyn's name in a way that almost satisfied me. Not fear exactly, more the sudden realization that the soft ground under his confidence had become visible to someone outside the family. Then he said the most revealing thing of all. He said, "So you're really going to drag strangers into this? Strangers. As if law were an intrusion and not the only reason truth ever survives certain families. as if betrayal becomes sacred the moment it happens between blood relatives behind closed doors. I stood up then. My voice stayed calm, but there was no softness left in it. I told him what he had done stopped being a family matter the moment he tried to convert my silence into consent. I told him to take the pecan rolls and leave. He did take the bag. That detail still matters to me. A proud man, forced to pick up the sweetness he brought to cover rot. He walked to the door without another word, but before he stepped out, he turned and said, "You always did think Daddy loved you best." There it was. Not the land, not the taxes, not practical pressure. The old wound underneath all of it, sour and breathing at last. I did not answer him, because by then I understood something painful and complete. Money had only given shape to an injury that was already living inside him. The land was valuable, yes, but what he had truly wanted was the right to decide which parts of Daddy's love counted after death. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the quiet and let that truth settle. Then I walked to the kitchen table, opened my notebook, and wrote down every word he had said while the room still held his voice. By the next morning, Evelyn had confirmation that the buyer's side had received notice and that the title concern was no longer something anyone could pretend was minor, which meant the truth was about to leave private kitchens and family phones and move into places where people had to use their full names. And once that happened, shame would no longer belong only to me. And once that happened, shame would no longer belong only to me. It is a strange thing to say, but that was the first moment I felt my spine return to me. Not victory, not relief, just the steadying knowledge that I was no longer the only person carrying the emotional cost of what had been done. For weeks, maybe months, my family had been living inside a private arrangement where I was the last person expected to know, the last person expected to object, and the first person expected to absorb the discomfort once the facts were too far along to undo neatly. Now the circle had widened. Clerks knew. Lawyers knew. A buyer with money on the line knew. And when truth reaches people who are not emotionally invested in protecting your family mythology, it begins to sound very different. The first real crack came through Marcus. He called me 2 days after Calvin left my house, and I almost did not answer. But something in me wanted to hear which version of conscience had finally reached him. His voice sounded younger than usual, stripped of the casual confidence he wore around the rest of the family. He did not bother with small talk. He said he thought things had been mostly handled, and when I did not respond, he rushed to add that he had not known the title issue was that serious. I let him keep talking until he told on himself properly. He said the buyer had gotten nervous after the legal notice, and now everybody was upset because something that should have stayed simple was turning public. Simple. That word lodged in me like a splinter. There it was again, that family habit of calling a thing simple when the real labour had only been assigned to someone else. I asked Marcus whether he ever once thought to call me before money got involved. He was quiet long enough that I could hear traffic on his end, a door closing somewhere behind him, the ordinary sounds of a life still moving while mine had been dragged open and rearranged. Then he said he figured Calvin had already spoken to me in his own way. That line told me more than his apology ever could. In our family, men had been getting credit for intentions they never carried out for so long that the younger ones no longer knew the difference between assumption and decency. I told Marcus not to call again unless he was ready to put the truth in writing. Then I hung up, and for the first time since all this began, I did not shake afterward. The second crack came from the church. Now, I am not a woman who enjoys mixing private pain with public prayer circles. Some people do that easily, They lay their lives out on folding chairs with styrofoam cups of coffee and let sympathy wash over the details until everything sounds cleaner than it was. I have never been built that way. But families like mine count on your reluctance to be seen in pain. They count on your dignity to do half their hiding for them. So when Sister Evelyn from church called and asked, in that careful voice people use when they already know more than they want to admit, whether I was all right, I understood the story had started moving on its own. Apparently, Denise had mentioned there was some confusion over the Pine Hollow property, and by the time that sentence travelled through 2 casseroles and 1 prayer request, confusion had picked up the odour of scandal. I could have denied it. I could have smiled and said, families go through things, but I was too tired to protect people who had built their comfort out of my silence. I simply said there was no confusion. There had been concealment. Sister Evelyn went quiet. Then she said, I thought as much. That conversation did not become gossip in the way cruel people hope for. It became something worse for my family. It became clarity. Quiet, respectable clarity. The kind that settles into a church foyer when people begin looking at someone, not with drama, but with new understanding. Nobody stood up and announced what Calvin had done. Nobody needed to. Once people suspect a man has handled the dead father's land with more confidence than honesty, they begin replaying his whole public character in a different light. The buyer backed away a week later. Not because of me personally. That mattered more than revenge ever could have. He backed away because uncertainty is expensive, and my brother had tried to sell certainty he did not own. Evelyn called to tell me the deal had stalled hard after document review widened. There were questions now, not just about title, but about representations made during negotiation. Questions about who knew what, who had authority, and when my interests had been disclosed. Hearing that did not make me smile. It made me sit down slowly at the edge of my bed and stare at the quilt my mother pieced together 30 years ago. I thought I would feel triumphant when the sale collapsed. Instead, I felt the deep ache of finally seeing how far they had all been willing to walk before anyone stopped to ask whether I still stood in the road. Asha came by after that. She did not call first, which was fitting considering how this began. I saw her from the window, standing on my porch with her hands clasped too tightly, and her pretty face washed bare of the confidence she usually wore like jewellery. She looked smaller somehow. Not younger, just less arranged. I let her stand there long enough to understand that knocking on my door was not the same thing as stepping back into the version of me she had counted on. When I opened it, she started crying almost immediately. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, leaking tears of someone whose own reflection has begun to trouble her. She said she never meant for me to find out like that. I asked her how she meant for me to find out. That stopped her. Then, after a long pause, she said something that I think will stay with me for the rest of my life. She said, I thought they'd already decided what was fair, and I didn't think my place was to question it. That is how harm survives in families. Not always through masterminds and monsters. Sometimes through younger people who learn too early that belonging is easier if you call obedience maturity. Asha had not created the betrayal, but she had warmed herself at its fire. She had accepted the family's version of reasonableness because it asked nothing costly from her except a little silence and a little mockery in the right group chat. I could see, standing there on my porch, that she was ashamed. But shame is not innocence. It is only the beginning of it. I told her the cruelest part was not the mistake. It was that her mistake showed me the voice she used when she believed I was not in the room. She covered her mouth when I said that. I think that landed harder than anything about the land. Because land can be measured, valued, divided. But the private voice people use for you when they think you cannot hear them, That reveals the true shape of your place in their heart. Asha asked what she could do. I told her to stop calling betrayal practicality just because older people used calm voices while doing it. I told her to remember this feeling the next time a room full of family asks her to confuse loyalty with silence. Then I said she could leave. She did. And though I did not slam the door, something closed all the same. Calvin did not come back to my house after that. He sent one message through Evelyn's office about working toward a family resolution, which sounded to me like a man suddenly discovering he preferred privacy after public confidence stopped paying. Denise stopped speaking to me entirely. Loretta sent one text saying she hated how messy things had gotten, as if messiness had arrived from the sky instead of from a choice made in secret. That was another lesson this season gave me. The people who help create a wound are often most offended by the sight of blood. By late summer, the immediate danger around the sale had passed. The transaction was dead. Additional paperwork had been halted. Boundary access was restricted. Evelyn helped me get the parcel status cleaned up enough that nobody could casually mark it around my existence again. It was not a magical ending. There were still files to review, signatures to correct, old probate knots to untangle. Justice in real life is often paperwork with a tired face. But the important thing was this: they had not erased me, not legally, not morally, not in the place that mattered most. The first time I went back to the land after everything settled, I went alone. The day was cooler by then, early autumn just beginning to thread through the trees. The field did not look changed at first glance, which moved me more than I expected. I think part of me had imagined the land itself would feel violated somehow, that it would carry visible damage from all the human greed dragged across it. But the grass still bent in the wind the same way. The creek still moved under its bank with that low, private sound. The fence still leaned where Daddy always said it would need replacing one day. The world had not rearranged itself around my betrayal. In some ways that steadied me. In some ways, it broke my heart all over again. I walked as far as I could toward the tree line and stood where Daddy used to stand. I could almost see the posture of him there, hands on hips, eyes narrowed against the light, measuring more than distance. For a while I said nothing. Then I finally spoke out loud, though there was no one there to answer. I said, "They almost made me feel like I was the extra piece." The wind moved through the tall grass and laid it down in one direction, then another. I stood there with tears I did not wipe away because I was too old and too tired to perform dignity for trees. After a while, I took Daddy's old letter from my purse and read the line again. May knows this ground. 4 words. Such a small inheritance on paper. But there are times when being rightly named can keep a whole life from collapsing inward. I did not leave that day feeling healed in some perfect, shining way. That is not how these things work. I left feeling truer. The difference matters. Healing is not always warmth. Sometimes it is the cold, clean return of your own outline after other people have spent months trying to blur it. Since then, I have changed some things. I do not answer certain calls. I no longer sit through family meals where politeness is expected to do the work of repentance. I have learned that a boundary does not become unkind just because somebody else profits from your lack of one. And I have stopped confusing being needed with being valued. That lesson cost me more than I would have liked, but I do not think I could have learned it any cheaper. As for Asha, she sends holiday cards now with longer notes than she used to. I read them, sometimes I answer, sometimes I do not. I am not interested in punishing her for the rest of her life, but neither will I rush to make my forgiveness comfortable for people who learned from my pain. Calvin and I speak only when required, And even then, the words are plain, stripped of the old family fog. I grieve that more than I say out loud. He was my brother before he was my betrayer. Both things remain true. That may be the hardest part of growing older, realizing that justice does not always erase love. It simply refuses to let love lie about what it has become. If there is any peace in what happened, it is this. The very thing they thought would keep me small was the thing that saved me. One mistaken group chat. One careless message sent under the protection of assumed absence. They believed I was outside the room already. But sometimes all it takes is one wrong thread, one dropped mask, one moment of being underestimated, and the whole hidden architecture of a family reveals itself in full. Sometimes the most painful discovery is not that people tried to take GK. It is that they had already made emotional room for your disappearance before they ever moved the papers. And sometimes the only way to survive that knowledge is to stand still long enough to hear your own name clearly again. If the people who shared your blood had mistaken your patience for surrender, would you still call it love? Or would you finally call it what it cost you?